Have you ever considered that one photo can turn your whole life upside down? No? Then listen carefully. This is not just a case from my medical practice. This is the story of how one small detail, just a shabby black and white photograph, was the beginning of the most unexpected discovery of my life. When she walked into my office, I didn't pay much attention to her. Just an ordinary woman in her 50s, complaining of fatigue, headaches, like hundreds of other patients I see every day. Nothing noteworthy, nothing to make me suspicious or thoughtful. I did the standard exam as I always do, made a few recommendations. That would have been the end of the story, except for one moment. One unexpected, even strange gesture that turned everything upside down. Discovery of my life.
Thank you for watching my channel. I create videos for your enjoyment. Please subscribe if you want to support my efforts, it's very important to me. I apologize in advance for any mistakes, dubbing is done by neural network. Please point out mistakes in the comments so I can correct them.
When she walked into my office, I didn't pay much attention to her. Just an ordinary woman in her 50s, complaining of fatigue, headaches, like hundreds of other patients I see every day. Nothing noteworthy, nothing to make me suspicious or thoughtful. I did the standard exam as I always do, made a few recommendations. That would have been the end of the story, except for one moment. One unexpected, even strange gesture that turned everything upside down. "Doctor," she said, as I was finishing writing up my appointments, "there's something I need to tell you. It's not just about my health." I was wary, but I tried to hide my surprise. You know, you should always be prepared for patients to share something personal, something that seems important to them. But I wasn't prepared for what followed her words. She slowly pulled a photograph out of her bag and held it out to me. "Here, take a look." It was from that moment that my life changed. At first glance, it was just a plain old photo, a few people on the riverbank, smiling happily at the camera. I didn't even immediately realize what it was about. But when my gaze stopped on one of the faces, I felt uneasy. It was me in the picture. My childhood image, captured many years ago. And that's when I realized this woman was more than just a patient. At this point, you already know something's wrong, right? Some piece of the puzzle falls out of the picture, and you start to be drawn to unravel the mystery. That's what I did. I didn't know the whole truth at that moment, but I was sure it wasn't a chance meeting. Why did she bring me this picture? What does it have to do with my past? And now for the best part. I promise that at the end of the video you will learn something shocking, something that will turn this whole story upside down. So stay with me until the end, because the real drama is just beginning. When you live your life, seeing patients every day, facing their problems, you get used to a certain routine. But everything changes when unexpected facts come crashing down on your head that not only change your perception, but make you dig into the past. "Are you sure?" I asked her, taking another look at the photo. "Are you sure it's me?" Olga, that was her name, to be exact, nodded. Her eyes shone with a strange light. She seemed to have been preparing for this conversation for a long time. And now, at last, she had made up her mind. "Yes, it's you. You were just a little boy. We were vacationing in the country back then. Our families were close." Families. That word echoed in my head. I don't remember my mother talking about any friends from the past. All these years, she had avoided talking about what had happened before my father died. And now here stood before me a woman who claimed to have known him. And knew me in years I couldn't even remember. My mother. She never told me about it, I admitted. Olga sighed. Her face darkened with sadness. "I'm not surprised. After he died, your mother changed. She withdrew into herself, stopped communicating with our families. We tried to keep in touch, but it was futile. She just disappeared from our lives." I stared at the photograph in silence. Mixed feelings swept over me. On the one hand, it was a painful revelation that reopened old wounds in my soul. On the other hand, I felt a strange relief. It was as if someone had given me the key to a locked chest of memories. "Why did you bring it now?" I asked. Olga smiled with a kind of sad, almost maternal warmth. "I wanted to do it a long time ago. But only now I decided to do it. You must know the truth about your father, Andrei. He was more than just a friend to us. He was part of our family." That's when I caught my breath. What did she mean? Why did her words sound like she knew more about my family than I did? I will tell the continuation of this story very soon, and believe me, it will be even more intriguing. When she said the words, part of our family, I felt everything inside me freeze. Questions flashed through my mind that I didn't know the answer to. How could my father be part of another family? What did that even mean? But instead of pouncing on Olga with questions, I kept my cool. Being a doctor teaches self-control, and at times like this, it's especially important. Can you explain what you mean? I asked, trying not to betray my confusion. Olga looked at me with a soft smile, but there was tension in her eyes. It was as if she didn't know how to start this conversation either. She took a deep breath and said, "Your father was more than just a friend to us. He helped our family, he was like a second father to me. I grew up in hard times, and if it weren't for him, maybe my life would have turned out very differently. But after he died, your family cut all ties with us." It was as if her words had torn the thin film that had kept a part of my life from me all this time. My mother never told me about it. All I knew about my childhood was from the years when my father was still alive. After he died, our lives really changed. My mom became self-absorbed and all her energy went into just surviving. She and I rarely talked about the past. And now this is a secret I didn't even know I had. Why did you decide to tell me this now? I asked again, feeling not only curiosity rising inside, but fear as well. Olga hesitated, her gaze becoming even harder. Because you need to know the truth, Andre. And it concerns not only your past, but also your mother. Here I couldn't stay calm anymore. What is she talking about? What truth do I need to know about my mother? All these questions swirled in my head as I tried to make sense of what I was hearing. I was on the edge between curiosity and fear of learning more. But before I could ask another question, she continued. After your father died, we tried to keep in touch with your family, but your mother refused all contact. We were close to your father, and after he left, it was like she wanted to erase us from her life. And not just us. Her words made me stop. Wipe us out of her life? Why would my mother do that? And what does it mean for me? Perhaps my past hid more than I could imagine. Olga was silent, as if waiting for me to react. And I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to just end this conversation, let her go and forget it all like a bad dream. But the other part of me wanted to keep going. I felt like I was on the verge of something important, something that would change my whole life. What exactly do you want to tell me? I finally asked, unable to bear the tension any longer. Olga sighed quietly and, as if gathering courage, said, "You don't know the whole truth about your family, Andre. And I want to help you figure it out. You should know that you have a sister." That's when I couldn't take it anymore. My world seemed to fall apart in that moment. A sister? How is that possible? I never knew I had a sister. My mother never told me about it. All these years I had lived in the belief that my family was just my mother and me. How could that be? Olga continued talking, but I couldn't listen to her anymore. 1,000 thoughts were buzzing in my head, but none of them could explain how it was that I had a sister I knew nothing about. Your mother didn't want you to find out, Olga said, bringing me back to reality. She decided to keep it from you because she thought it would be better for you. But I couldn't keep quiet any longer. You have the right to know the truth. I sat in silence, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. Olga, a woman who just a few minutes ago was just a patient, had suddenly become something much more. She brought me not only an old photograph, but a secret that changed my perception of myself and my past. The story is not over. More revelations would come next that would call into question everything I knew about my family. My mind was all jumbled up. I had too many questions, but each one led to the inevitable, the search for the truth I never knew. How could I have lived so many years without knowing I had a sister? And more importantly, where is she now? The feeling was akin to when you fumble for something unfamiliar in a dark room and don't know whether to be afraid of it or delighted. I was still sitting looking at the photograph when Olga interrupted my silence. Andre, I realize that this is a shock for you. But I hope you realize that something has to be done. Things will not resolve themselves. I wanted to object. Inside me boiled a cocktail of resentment at my mother, curiosity and a sense of betrayal. Why had she done this? Why did she hide the truth? But instead, I asked quietly, when did it all start? Why don't I remember anything? Olga took a deep breath and, slowly choosing her words, began to tell me. Your mother. She was always a strong woman, but your father's death destroyed her. I'm not saying this to justify what she did, but she really thought she was doing the right thing. You were just a child then. And your sister. Her life didn't turn out as you might expect. When you were little, you had a very close relationship with her. I remember you playing together. But after that tragedy, your family fell apart, and your mother decided to shield you from anything that reminded her of the past, including your sister. I gripped the edge of the table, listening to her words. It was so strange, hearing about a relationship that you yourself don't remember, but that was part of your life. She took you and just left. We tried to find you, but to no avail. At the time, your mother was so overwhelmed with grief that she couldn't talk to anyone. You don't remember anything because you were too young. But here it is, this picture, it's the only proof that you had another life. There was so much more I wanted to ask, but I suddenly realized that it all needed to be digested. Olga obviously knew more, but she wasn't telling me everything at once. I could feel it. Something else was hidden behind her words. After my meeting with Olga, I didn't find myself for a few days. My mind was spinning with millions of thoughts, like unnecessary puzzles that did not add up to a coherent picture. At work I was distracted, constantly thinking about my sister, whom I had never known. Was it true? Or was it a mistake? And if true, where is she now? Is she alive? What does she look like? And most importantly, why had my mother never told me about her? A week later, I decided to visit my mother. It wasn't an easy step. I knew that this conversation would be painful, but I also knew that I couldn't move on without it. In my heart, I hoped that it was all a mistake, that my mother would explain everything, and it would turn out that Olga had just made a mistake. I arrived at her house late in the evening, when it was already beginning to get dark outside the windows. My mother lived alone, in the small apartment where we had once lived together. I stood in front of the door, and for a few minutes I just couldn't make up my mind to knock. It seemed to me that behind that door would open not just my childhood home, but a whole avalanche of the past that I would not be able to stop. Finally, I mustered up the courage to knock. My mom opened the door, and as always, smiled happily when she saw me. We hugged as we always did, but inside me it was different. "Hi, Mom," I began, trying to sound calm. "Hi, Andriasha," she hugged me tightly, as if she wanted to keep me in this moment, as if she felt that something was wrong. We walked to the kitchen. I sat down at the table, watching her movements while she poured tea. As always, the atmosphere in her house was cozy and familiar, but today everything seemed strangely alien to me. I was silent for a long time, not knowing how to start a conversation. "Mom," I said at last, "I need to ask you something." She sat down across from me, her face changed, her expression wary. "Will you ever tell me the truth?" I asked, realizing it sounded rude, but I couldn't hold back any longer. Mom tensed. Her eyes narrowed, as if she sensed I'd learned something she'd been hiding for so long. "What are you talking about, son?" I felt everything inside clench with pain and frustration. How many years had I lived believing I knew everything about my family, about my mother? And now it seemed like our whole life had been a lie. "About my sister, Mom. Why didn't you ever tell me about her?" Her face turned pale. She slowly set the cup down on the table, and her hands began to tremble. I had never seen my mother in such a state. It was as if her private world had shattered at that moment. "How did you? Who told you that?" She whispered without looking at me. "It doesn't matter, Mom. What matters is that you kept it from me. Hid the truth about my life." She didn't say anything. It seemed like she just couldn't find the words to explain. I sat across from her, feeling the chasm between us growing. "I thought it was for the best," she said finally, her voice shaking. "I wanted to keep you from getting hurt." "What pain, Mom? I'd rather know the truth than live a lie." "Did you decide it would be better for me not to know?" I felt anger rising up inside me, but I tried to hold it together. Mom sighed heavily and finally looked me in the eye. "Your sister. She left years ago. She left when you were still a baby. I couldn't tell you. You were too young to understand. And then it was too late." Mom began to tell her side of the story. Her voice trembled, her words struggling to come out. "It turned out that I did have a sister, older than me by a few years. When my father died, my mother was going through a difficult time, trying to cope with the loss. The sister, already a teenager, became withdrawn, began to clash with my mother and soon left home. The mother tried to bring her back, but it was no use. Their relationship was deteriorating day by day. My sister decided to cut all ties with the family and left for another city. After that, my mother decided it was better for me not to know about it. She didn't want me to suffer for losing another loved one. But there was more to it than that. My mother continued to tell her story, her voice growing quieter and quieter, her eyes filling more and more with the pain of the memories. I sat across from her, not knowing what to say, how to react. Thoughts swirled in my head. How could I have lived so many years without knowing I had a sister? Why did my mother choose to hide it? But the question that tormented me the most was, what really happened that made my sister leave the family? After your father died, she began again, we all changed. I couldn't cope with the loss, and I think at some point I just missed my daughter. She became a stranger. Every day she became more and more distant. I tried talking to her, explaining things to her, but she was too stubborn. In the end, she just walked away, leaving me with you. Mom was silent, as if she wanted to find the words, but couldn't. I could see that this was unbearably hard for her, but she went on. She blamed me for being estranged from her after your father died. And she was probably right. I was too caught up in my own grief to be a good mother to her. I was afraid I'd lose you too, so I decided to shield you from that pain. She was gone, and I didn't want you to experience that. You were too young, so I decided it was best not to tell you anything. With every phrase she said, I could feel the anger building up inside me. She had made up her mind for me. She decided what was best for me. I ended up living my whole life in the dark. The questions just kept getting bigger. Why did she decide not to look for her sister? Why did she choose to just erase her from our lives? You could have tried to bring her back, I said, not hiding the hurt in my voice. Why did you just leave her behind? Mom sighed heavily, her eyes clouded. I tried. After she left, I tried several times to find her. But she wouldn't come back. At some point, she just stopped answering my calls and emails. I couldn't force her anymore. And then I just gave up. I decided it was better if you didn't know. You were just a kid. I didn't want you to suffer this loss like I did. At that moment, I couldn't hold back any longer. Anger and pain overwhelmed me. All these years, my entire childhood, I had lived under the illusion that I had only a mother, that I was an only child. And now I found out that I had a sister who was out of my life because of my mother's decision. You had no right to decide for me. I shouted, unable to contain my emotions any longer. You robbed me of the opportunity to know her, robbed me of my family. Mom cried quietly, her hands shaking as she tried to wipe away her tears. Her weakness only made me more angry, though I knew she was suffering too. I thought it was for the best, Andre. I didn't want to hurt you. You were too young to understand. But I'm an adult now. And now I don't know who I am. I have a sister I never knew. And all this time you've been silent, hiding the truth. I stood up, feeling like I couldn't be here anymore. I didn't want to see her tears. I didn't want to hear her excuses anymore. I left the apartment, slamming the door, and walked down the street, not knowing where to go. My mind was spinning with thoughts of what I had just learned. I had a sister. And somewhere out there, she might still be alive. The days passed in confusion. There was no way I could get back to normal after what I had learned. Every day was filled with thoughts about my sister, where she was and what had happened to her. But the question that tormented me the most was, why did she leave? What had happened that she had decided to cut all ties with our family? I tried to find answers in the past. I started digging through old family photo albums, looking for any mention of her. But my mother had indeed hidden everything carefully. I couldn't find a single picture of my sister, not a single letter or reminder that she even existed. It seemed that my mother had erased her from our lives like an unnecessary page from a book. Olga came to see me again a few weeks later. She knew I had learned the truth, but she didn't know how to approach it. When she sat down across from me, I immediately asked, Olga, do you know where my sister is? She hesitated, avoiding my gaze, as if she didn't want to tell me everything at once. I know that she left. But where she is now, I can't say for sure. The last time I heard from her was years ago. She moved to another city and cut off all contact. Do you know where exactly? I asked, feeling despair rising in me. Olga hesitated and finally nodded. I think she went to St. Petersburg. At least that was the last place I heard of. I started my own investigation. It wasn't easy, but I was determined to find my sister. I felt that I owed it to her, that it was the only way I could close this wound that had suddenly opened up in my soul. After talking to Olga, I realized that I would not be able to return to my old life until I found my sister. This feeling turned into an obsessive thought that would not let me rest. I felt that solving this puzzle would help me understand not only her, but also myself. My childhood was filled with invisible shadows, and I hoped that meeting my sister would dispel them. That night I sat in my apartment trying to make a plan. St. Petersburg is a huge city, and finding someone who might have disappeared from view decades ago was an almost impossible task. But I was determined. First of all, I decided to find out if there were any traces left connected to her past. I began to look for mentions of her in old documents and records that I could find. Mother, of course, had left no trace, but I still had clues. I remembered that once upon a time as children we had mutual friends that we played with, and if anyone could remember her existence, it was them. I decided to start by looking for these people. First I turned to the school archives where I found lists of students, teachers, and tried to track down anyone who might have known her. After several weeks of searching, I was finally able to find one of her school friends, Lena, who still lived in our old neighborhood. I arranged to meet Lena at a small cafe on the outskirts of town. When she arrived, I recognized her immediately from a photograph I had found in the school archives. Lena looked older than her years. Years of life full of worries and difficulties were imprinted on her face. I ordered her a cup of coffee, and after a brief greeting we got down to business. "Lena," I began, a little nervous, "I'm looking for my sister. I haven't seen her in a while, and I know you were friends in high school. Is there anything you can tell me about her?" Lena thought for a moment, as if trying to recollect the events of many years ago. "Yes, I remember her," she answered. "We really were friends at school. She was special. Silent, always aloof, but she had her own inner world. After your father died, she changed a lot. We talked less and less, and at some point she just disappeared. I remember her saying she wanted to move away, start a new life somewhere away from it all." I leaned forward, feeling like I was about to hear something important. "Do you know where she went?" I asked. Lena hesitated and answered quietly. Then she mentioned that she was going to go to Peter. We all thought it was just a dream, that she wouldn't make up her mind, but apparently she did. I never heard from her again after that. That confirmed Olga's words. My sister could indeed have gone to St. Petersburg, but beyond that I had no clue. Nevertheless, I was not going to give up. I had one small clue, and I was going to use it. I decided that I couldn't wait any longer, and I got ready to hit the road. I bought a train ticket and set off for St. Petersburg, hoping that fate would tell me where to look for my sister. The journey lasted several hours, but it seemed endless. My mind was swarming with thoughts of what meeting my sister might look like. What was she like now? Would she recognize me? And most importantly, would she forgive me for not knowing she existed for so long? When I arrived in the city, I felt both elation and fear. Peter was huge, and looking for a person in such a megalopolis seemed like a crazy idea. I realized that there was little chance of finding her, but my determination was unshakable. The first thing I did was head to the local archives, hoping to find any documents or traces that might point to her being here. I studied the lists of registered residents from previous years, tried to find her name in the databases. But the results were nil. Everything seemed futile. Several days passed, full of frustration and failure, when finally luck smiled on me. One of the archivists I met at a government office told me that he had seen a name similar to my sister's on the residence registration papers. He was not sure it was her, but he gave me an address where a woman with the same name might be registered. When I arrived at the address given, my heart was racing. It was an old time-darkened house on the outskirts of town, and I didn't know what to expect. Knocking on the door, I waited for several minutes that seemed like an eternity. Finally, the door opened, and a woman in her 40s stood before me. Her eyes were tired, but there was something about her face that seemed vaguely familiar. "Yes? What can I do for you?" she asked, looking at me warily. I took a deep breath and said, Are you my sister?" The woman was silent for a long time, her gaze running over my face as if she were trying to remember or figure out who I was. Suddenly her face changed. Her eyes filled with tears, and she whispered, "André?" That moment was overwhelming. I didn't know what to say, how to act. I was standing in front of a person I had never known, but who was a part of my life. We looked at each other in silence, as if trying to realize everything that had happened over the years. For the next few hours, my sister and I sat on the old couch in her apartment, talking like two people who had lost a lifetime of each other. She told me that after leaving home she had actually gone to St. Petersburg, got a job and started a new life. She tried to forget the past she wanted to escape from, but the memories of her family were always there. She never tried to contact her mother, too much pain and resentment left in the past, but she always remembered me. I thought of you often, she admitted. But I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how you'd grown, how you'd become. I was afraid you'd forget about me, or worse, hate me for leaving. Her words were drenched in pain, and I could feel something old and painful inside me tearing. I couldn't blame her because I was living in ignorance myself. I told her my version of events, how my mother had kept the truth from me, how I had lived without knowing she existed. This conversation was a turning point for both of us. We realized that we couldn't get the past back, but we could try to repair the relationship. The conversation with my sister seemed to last forever. We sat in her small apartment, immersed in memories I didn't even know I had and a past she was trying to forget. At some point it became clear that we were both victims of the same circumstances that had torn us apart. Now, meeting after so many years, we were able to rebuild our relationship, no longer as strangers, but as relatives who had just rediscovered each other. My sister, whose name was Anna, told me about her life after she left home. The first years in St. Petersburg were difficult for her. She lived in rented apartments, worked several low-paying jobs trying to survive. It was hard for her to adapt in a big city without the support of her family, but she still didn't try to return home. For her, it was a kind of symbolic breakup. She didn't want to go back to the past, to those painful memories associated with her father and mother. I remember when you were little, Anna said, her voice shaking with emotion. We were always there for each other. Things changed after Daddy died, but I remember how I protected you, how I tried to help Mommy. But she didn't seem to see me. She was always focused on herself and her grief. At some point, I just stopped being a part of her life. Her words sounded so sincere that I couldn't help but believe it. I could feel the immense pain and frustration behind it all. I thought back to my mother who, indeed, after my father's death, had completely withdrawn into herself. She had shut herself off from everyone, and as I now realized, this had affected not only Anna, but me as well. My sister was right. She had simply disappeared from my mother's life. And if it hadn't been for a chance meeting with Olga, I might never have known the truth. Did Mom try to find you? I asked cautiously, sensing that the question might hurt her feelings. Anna hesitated, then grinned slightly. Maybe she had tried. But you know, she never did it sincerely. I always thought she was just more comfortable forgetting about me than trying to repair the relationship. She was too wrapped up in her grief. And to be honest, I wasn't ready to go back. I'd held a grudge against her for too long. I listened to her, realizing that the resentment that had been building up in her was justified. Mother had indeed made a choice in deciding not to keep in touch with Anna. But the fact that Anna didn't try to come back either spoke volumes about how deep the hurt she carried was. What about me? I asked quietly. Why didn't you ever try to find me? Anna lowered her gaze, and I felt her shut down. I was afraid. Afraid you'd grow up different. That you'd forget about me, or worse, hate me. I thought you were a different person now, that I was just a stranger to you. Those words hurt me. I wanted to say that I would never forget her, but the truth was that I didn't remember her. My memory of my childhood was vague and fragmented. I remembered Olga and her saying that my father's family was an important part of their lives. Perhaps if my mother hadn't shut out the past, I would have remembered my sister. But now that she was around, I felt like we had a chance to change things. Our meetings with Anna became regular. We began to rebuild a relationship that had been torn apart by years of silence. It wasn't easy. Too many years had passed. Too many memories had been lost. But every time we met, I felt like I was rediscovering family. We talked about our childhood, about our parents, and each time new details came up that I never knew about. Do you remember how we used to go to the dacha every summer? Anna asked one day when we were sitting in a cafe. I nodded, though my memories were fuzzy. Yes, Mom always said those were our best years. But I don't remember much about those times. Anna smiled. I do. You and I were always playing by the river, building sandcastles. Daddy was with us. He taught us how to swim. Those were the happiest moments of my life. Her words were drenched in nostalgia. I understood that these memories were important to Anna, but to me they were something vague, like a hazy reflection of a past I had missed. Do you remember your father? She asked unexpectedly. I nodded, though I couldn't say my memories of him were clear. He was always a hero to me, I said. But after he died, everything changed. Anna looked at me with understanding. Yes, everything changed. And that's when I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't cope with him being gone. And Mom. It was like she didn't exist for me anymore. I just left. We fell silent, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts. I began to realize that Anna's leaving was her way of dealing with the pain. Her decision to sever ties with her family was the result of a loss she couldn't come to terms with. Our bond with Anna grew stronger, but I knew that was only half of the journey. There was still one more part left, the hardest part, meeting my mother. After our last conversation, I didn't call her or visit her. I knew she was waiting for my call, but I just couldn't make up my mind. How could I tell her about finding my sister? Would she be able to accept it, or would the old pain resurface again? One day I decided I couldn't put off this conversation any longer. I called my mother and told her I was coming over for dinner. She didn't ask why it had taken me so long to show up, although there was tension in her voice. We agreed to meet up over the weekend. When I arrived at my mother's house, she greeted me with a smile, but her eyes betrayed worry. We sat down at the table, and I sensed that this conversation was going to be difficult. "Mom," I began, trying to be as gentle as possible, "I have something important to tell you." She looked at me, waiting for me to continue. "I found her. I found Anna." The words hung in the air. Mom froze, and I saw her face go pale. She was silent for a long time, as if trying to comprehend what she had heard. Did you see her?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible. I nodded. "Yes. We met a few weeks ago. We talked about everything that happened. She wants to repair the relationship." Mom lowered her eyes, her hands starting to shake. I knew it was a blow to her. Anna was the pain she'd been trying to forget all these years. And now that the truth had come out, it was hard for her to accept. "She's gone," Mom said quietly. "She was just gone, and I couldn't bring her back." "But you didn't even try," I exclaimed, unrestrained. "You just let her leave and decided it was best to keep it from me." Mom looked at me with pain in her eyes. "I thought it would be better this way. I didn't know how to deal with the loss. I had lost my husband and then my daughter. I was afraid I would lose you too." Her words silenced me. I realized that she, too, was a victim of circumstance. We were all affected by this loss, but we all dealt with it in our own way. My mom sat across from me, her face filled with pain that she had been hiding for a long time. It became clear to me that our family had never been able to cope with the loss of my father. Mom had lost not only her husband, but herself and, at one point, her children. But now, so many years later, I could see her inner walls crumbling. She wasn't ready for the past to come back. "I didn't know what to do," she continued quietly. "When Anna left, I felt like I had lost everything. I couldn't bring her back. And I thought that if I held you close, I could save something." Her confession tore me apart. On the one hand, I was angry at her for keeping the truth from me. On the other hand, I realized she hadn't done it out of malice. Her decisions were driven by fear and pain, and I could see that she was suffering deeply because of it. "I don't blame you, Mom," I said, pulling myself together. "But you have to realize that by hiding the truth, you've only made things more difficult. I grew up without knowing Anna existed, and it left a mark on me. We were both victims of that situation." She nodded quietly, her eyes glistening with tears. "I realize that now. But back then I just didn't know how to move on. After your father died, I was broken. I couldn't cope with the fact that everything I knew was shattered. I lost everyone I cared about." Her words mirrored the pain I had always felt in our home, but could never quite understand its source. Now everything was falling into place. Mom was broken, and her choices were dictated by that pain. It didn't excuse her actions, but it helped me understand her motives. "Mom," I started again softer, "Anna is alive. She wants to rebuild the relationship, and I think it's possible. We can try to start over. We can fix what was broken years ago." Mom looked at me with hope and fear at the same time. "Do you think she can forgive me?" Her voice was barely audible. "I think it won't be easy. But she's suffered all these years too. If we're all willing to try, it could be the start of something new. We can't change the past, but we can try to rebuild what is still possible." Those words hung in the air, and I could see them slowly reaching her consciousness. I realized that this journey would be long and difficult for us all, but we had a chance. A chance to right the wrongs of the past. We agreed to meet the three of us in a week. I spoke to Anna and told her that her mother was ready to see her. Anna was tense, her voice trembling as she agreed. I knew it would be as much of an ordeal for her as it was for her mother. When the day of the meeting arrived, I drove Anna to her mother's house. We drove in silence for a long time, and I could feel the tension building. Anna stared out the window, clearly trying to cope with her emotions. She had told me more than once that she wasn't sure if she was ready to meet her mother, but she had decided to take the step. When we pulled up to the house, Anna stopped in front of the door, took a deep breath, and said quietly, "I don't know what to say to her." "Just be honest," I replied, trying to encourage her. "It's going to be hard, but we have to get through this." I opened the door and we walked into the house. Mom was already waiting for us in the living room. Her face was pale, and I could see her hands trembling slightly. She was as nervous as Anna. When Anna entered the room, they both froze for a moment, as if they couldn't believe this was really happening. There was silence in the air. "Anna," Mom said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. Anna looked at her, and I saw pain and resentment flash in her eyes. She was silent for a long time, not knowing how to start the conversation. "Mom," she finally said, her voice strained. "I don't know why I'm here. But I do know that we can no longer live in the past." Mom couldn't hold back the tears. Her face contorted with emotion and she, almost on edge, said, "I'm sorry. I can't believe it's really you. I've lived in fear for so many years that I've lost you forever." Anna continued to stand there, unmoving, as if trying to digest her mother's words. I knew that for her, this moment was one of the most difficult of her life. The past was too heavy, and she couldn't just forget it. But I also knew that she had come here with the hope that this meeting would help her heal. "You never tried to find me," Anna said, her voice shaking with contained anger. "You just let me go." "Why?" Mom sobbed, her words barely audible. "I didn't know how. I was broken. After you left, I couldn't cope. I didn't know how to move on. I was so ashamed of everything that had happened." Anna looked at her with cold determination, but I could see tears starting to form in her eyes. This was the moment when all their inner walls started to crumble. "I don't want to live in this past anymore," Anna said, her voice firm. "But I want to try to understand you. We've lost too much time to keep losing each other." Mom nodded, her face contorted with pain, but there was understanding in her eyes. This was not the end, but the beginning of a long and difficult journey to rebuild their relationship. But this step they had taken was the most important. Several months passed after that first meeting. We started building a new relationship as a threesome, trying to forget old hurts and focus on the present. It wasn't easy. Every time we got together, there were shadows of the past that reminded us of ourselves. But we tried. I felt like we had a chance now that we didn't have before. Anna began to visit her mother more often. They talked at length, discussing the past, and I could see an understanding slowly emerging between them. Mother tried to atone for her mistakes, and Anna tried to forgive her. It was difficult, but every day their relationship grew stronger. I too changed during this time. My life was filled with reflection on my family, what I had missed out on, and what we could build. I realized that you can't change the past, but you can take its lessons and use them to make the future better. We continued to meet, and each time we did, those meetings became warmer and more sincere. Several years have passed since we began to rebuild our relationship. Anna, my mom, and I have been slowly building the connection we haven't had in years. It was a slow process, sometimes painful, but every step was important. Time healed the wounds and our meetings became more and more natural. Anna had changed. She stopped holding so much resentment and pain inside her. I saw her face soften, her face start to smile again, and I realized that everything we had been through was not in vain. She was part of our family again. But most importantly, we all learned to be honest with each other. Mom and I had changed, too. Mom no longer tried to hide her feelings, no longer hid behind a wall of grief and loss. She was open to dialogue, and I could see how much easier her life became. She realized that we were her family, that she hadn't lost us, and that despite the mistakes of the past, we could be together. Every family event we had together, dinners, holidays, or just quiet evenings over a cup of tea, became a symbol that relationships can be restored if there is a will and effort. We no longer talked about the past with pain. We learned to remember our father without tears, to share the memories we had, and to talk about the years that separated us as a time that could not be brought back, but could be forgiven. When we all got together one day for a celebration, I felt how this new life felt natural to us. We were a family, not perfect, not sinless, but real, with hurts, forgiveness, and new hopes. I watched my mom and Anna interact with each other. Their conversations were full of warmth, and I could see the former tension disappear. They had both learned to forgive themselves for past mistakes. That was the most important thing of all. Forgiveness didn't come easily, but they realized it was the only way to find the inner peace and family they had once lost. Anna told me once that she never imagined she could feel happy. She was back in her life, but now with a new outlook on things. She no longer tried to run away from the past, but embraced it and made it part of her future. "I'm glad you found me," she said one day. "I didn't know I needed it. But now I realize that family is the most important thing we have." I smiled, knowing she was right. All these years, everything we've been through has brought us to this moment. Life doesn't stop. We all keep moving forward, but now with a different understanding of ourselves and each other. Our relationship with Anna and my mom has grown stronger, and that gives me confidence that the future will be better. We have learned to appreciate every moment together and not to forget how easily we can lose each other. Mom is no longer the same woman who was broken by grief. She has found a new sense of life, realizing that she can still change many things in her life. She is no longer afraid to talk about the past, about the things that troubled her. We can now discuss these things calmly, realizing that they can no longer break us. Anna, too, has found peace of mind. She forgave her mother, and that was the biggest step for her. Her life in St. Petersburg continues, but now she comes to our house regularly and we spend a lot of time together. As for me, I realized one simple truth: family is not only the past, but also the future. We may not choose our family, but we can choose how we build a relationship with them. And now, so many years later, I know that everything we've been through has made us stronger. This story isn't just about how I found my sister and rebuilt my family. It's a story about forgiveness, about the importance of not running away from the past, but embracing it, no matter how hard it is. We all make mistakes, but if we are willing to work on ourselves, willing to listen and forgive, we can change our lives for the better. The photo that Olga brought me many years ago changed not only my perception of my family, but my whole outlook on life. I realized that the past will always be a part of us, but it should not determine our future. We can decide for ourselves what we will become and how we will build our relationships. Now when I look at this picture, it no longer causes me pain or questions. It reminds me that even the deepest wounds can be healed if there is love, forgiveness, and a willingness to accept the truth, no matter how bitter it may be. Our family's story is a story of second chances, and I am grateful that we had that chance.